This is an ABC News special report. Now reporting, George Stephanopoulos.
Good morning. We're back on the air right now because President Trump about to address the nation in the wake of those twin shootings over the weekend. El Paso, Texas, Dayton, Ohio, 29 dead, 53 wounded this weekend in the latest mass shootings in this country that have rocked the country, shaken the country to its core, and raised real questions for President Trump. One of the reasons he's coming out to address the country this morning, questions about whether his rhetoric is fueling some of this violence. Also questions about what Washington and the president are going to do about guns in this country right now in the wake of these deadly shootings. I'm here with our senior White House correspondent, Cecilia Vega. The president did put out a tweet this morning suggesting he does want some action.
Suggesting that he wants some action, perhaps on background checks, but he also then tied these shootings to potential immigration reform. That's not going to fly on Capitol Hill. There's really no incentive at this point for Republicans on the Hill to move forward on gun control. So it remains to be seen exactly how President Trump is going to move forward with this. George, 12 of the nation's deadliest mass shootings have happened so far under President Trump's administrative watch. We will be looking today to see if he uses the words domestic terrorism to address these shootings, particularly the one in El Paso, and white nationalists. We'll see if he calls them out.
And here comes the president and the vice president now.
Good morning. My fellow Americans, this morning, our nation is overcome with shock, horror, and sorrow. This weekend, more than 80 people were killed or wounded in two evil attacks. One Saturday morning in El Paso, Texas, a wicked man went to a Walmart store where families were shopping with their loved ones. He shot and murdered 20 people and injured 26 others, including precious little children. Then, in the early hours of Sunday morning, Dayton, Ohio, another twisted monster opened fire on a crowded downtown street. He murdered 9 people, including his own sister, and injured 27 others. The First Lady and I join all Americans in praying and grieving for the victims, their families, and the survivors. We will stand by their side forever. We will never forget. These barbaric slaughters are an assault upon our communities, an attack upon our nation, and a crime against all of humanity. We are outraged and sickened by this monstrous evil, the cruelty, the hatred, the malice, the bloodshed, and the terror. Our hearts are shattered for every family whose parents, children, husbands, and wives were ripped from their arms and their lives. America weeps for the fallen. We are a loving nation, and our children are entitled to grow up in a just, peaceful, and loving society. Together, we lock arms to shoulder the grief. We ask God in heaven to ease the anguish of those who suffer, and we vow to act with urgent resolve. I want to thank the many law enforcement personnel who responded to these atrocities with the extraordinary grace and courage of American heroes. I have spoken with Texas Governor Greg Abbott and Ohio Governor Mike DeWine, as well as Mayor DeMargo of El Paso, Texas, and Mayor Nan Whaley of Dayton, Ohio, to express our profound sadness and unfailing support. Today, we also send the condolences of our nation to President Obrador of Mexico and all the people of Mexico for the loss of their citizens in the El Paso shooting. Terrible, terrible thing. I have also been in close contact with Attorney General Barr and FBI Director Wray. Federal authorities are on the ground, and I have directed them to provide any and all assistance required, whatever is needed. The shooter in El Paso posted a manifesto online consumed by racist hate. In one voice, our nation must condemn racism, bigotry, and white supremacy. These sinister ideologies must be defeated. Hate has no place in America. Hatred warps the mind, ravages the heart, and devours the soul. We have asked the FBI to identify all further resources they need to investigate and disrupt hate crimes and domestic terrorism, whatever they need. We must recognize that the Internet has provided a dangerous avenue to radicalize disturbed minds and perform demented acts. We must shine light on the dark recesses of the Internet and stop mass murders before they start. The Internet, likewise, is used for human trafficking, illegal drug distribution, and so many other heinous crimes. The perils of the Internet and social media cannot be ignored, and they will not be ignored. In the 2 decades since Columbine, our nation has watched with rising horror and dread as one mass shooting has followed another, over and over again, decade after decade. We cannot allow ourselves to feel powerless. We can and will stop this evil contagion. In that task, we must honor the sacred memory of those we have lost by acting as one people. Open wounds cannot heal if we are divided. We must seek real bipartisan solutions. We have to do that in a bipartisan manner that will truly make America safer and better for all. First, we must do a better job of identifying and acting on early warning signs. I am directing the Department of Justice to work in partnership with local, state, and federal agencies, as well as social media companies, to develop tools that can detect mass shooters before they strike. As an example, the monster in the Parkland High School in Florida had many red flags against him, and yet nobody took decisive action. Nobody did anything. Why not? Second, we must stop the glorification of violence in our society. This includes the gruesome and grisly video games that are now commonplace. It is too easy today for troubled youth to surround themselves with a culture that celebrates violence. We must stop or substantially reduce this, and it has to begin immediately. Cultural change is hard, but each of us can choose to build a culture that celebrates the inherent worth and dignity of every human life. That's what we have to do. Third, we must reform our mental health laws to better identify mentally disturbed individuals who may commit acts of violence and make sure those people not only get treatment, but when necessary, involuntary confinement. Mental illness and hatred pulls the trigger, not the gun. Fourth, we must make sure that those judged to pose a grave risk to public safety do not have access to firearms, and that if they do, those firearms can be taken through rapid due process. That is why I have called for red flag laws, also known as extreme risk protection orders. Today, I'm also directing the Department of Justice to propose legislation ensuring that those who commit hate crimes and mass murders face the death penalty, and that this capital punishment be delivered quickly, decisively, and without years of needless delay. These are just a few of the areas of cooperation that we can pursue. I am open and ready to listen and discuss all ideas that will actually work and make a very big difference. Republicans and Democrats have proven that we can join together in a bipartisan fashion to address this plague. Last year, we enacted the Stop School Violence and Fix NICS Acts into law, providing grants to improve school safety and strengthening critical background checks for firearm purchases. At my direction, the Department of Justice banned bump stocks. Last year, we prosecuted a record number of firearms offenses. But there is so much more that we have to do. Now is the time to set destructive partisanship aside, so destructive, and find the courage to answer hatred with unity, devotion, and love. Our future is in our control. America will rise to the challenge. We will always have, and we always will, win. The choice is ours, and ours alone. It is not up to mentally ill monsters. It is up to us. If we are able to pass great legislation after all of these years, we will ensure that those who were attacked will not have died in vain. May God bless the memory of those who perished in Toledo. And may God protect them. May God protect all of those from Texas to Ohio. May God bless the victims and their families. May God bless America. Thank you very much. Thank you.
President Trump there, along with Vice President Pence, leaving the diplomatic room at the White House after giving about 10 minutes of remarks on what he called the two evil attacks this weekend in El Paso, Texas, Dayton, Ohio. Said they were carried out by wicked men, a twisted monster. And the president, in his strongest language yet, condemning racism and white supremacy, said that all our nation must condemn racism, bigotry, and white supremacy. Then laid out about a 6-point program on what we can do to address this violence, saying more citizens should do more to call out people who they think might be prone to violence, saying we have to stop the glorification of violence on the internet and social media. Also, we should strengthen our mental health laws so that people who might be prone to violence because of a mental imbalance are also identified and treated. Said there should be no access to firearms for those prone to violence, and also called for the death penalty for those who commit hate crimes, and asked for a process to accelerate the sentencing there as well. What he did not call for was any new background check legislation or any new gun control legislation in those few minutes where he did speak. Of course, that's what Democrats and others have called for in the wake of these latest mass shootings. I want to bring our team in for all this right now. David Muir, Woolner's ankle. David Muir is down there in El Paso. David, I know you've been speaking with residents, citizens, officials there in the last 24 hours. What were they expecting to hear from the president? Do you think they heard what they needed to hear?
Well, I'll tell you, George, one thing that is inescapable here on the ground in El Paso is something that the police chief flat out said to me in conversations with him in the last 24 hours, Greg Allen. This suspect in this case, 21-year-old Patrick Crucius, came from Allen, Texas, 600 miles away, 10 hours to get here. It's just outside of Dallas, by the way. He could have gone to Dallas or elsewhere, but he chose El Paso, authorities believe, because of the makeup of this community, George, because of its proximity to the U.S.-Mexico border. And of course, what they're concerned about here is the rhetoric in this country when it comes to immigration, when it comes to race. And, we did hear the president there talk about video games, about social media, about mental health, as you pointed out, George. But we didn't hear from the president is anything about the temperature of the rhetoric right now here in America and whether or not that's playing any sort of role. They do believe here on the ground. I had a woman talk to me a short time ago. She and her mother were on the floor of the cafe here in the Walmart behind me. She showed me the video, the gunman actually walking towards the cafe, towards them. The only reason he turned around was because people were running to get out. They made noise. He turned around and continued his firing. But she looked at me and she said, we're scared here in El Paso. We need to be protected. They're aware of how heightened the anger is in this country, the hatred in this country, and they're desperate for solutions and for more to be done, George.
David Muir in El Paso. Eva Pilgrim on the ground also in Dayton, and the calls for action immediate in that city, Eva.
Yeah, that's right, George. Every time we turn up to one of these cities where a mass shooting like this has happened, people are always in shock. We are definitely feeling more of a sense of frustration here from people than we have ever before. Frustration for something to change, something to be different. Last night they held a vigil for all of the victims of this particular attack. And as the governor of Ohio took the stage, he was overpowered by chants of do something. People want something substantial. Words are not enough. And there's a real fear that these mass shootings and the quantity of mass shootings that we keep seeing is becoming our new normal, a new normal in places that we've otherwise felt safe. And the question is, where can you go that you don't have to worry about something like this happening? George?
That is a big question right now. I want to bring in our Chief Justice correspondent, Pierre Thomas, for more on this as well. One of the other phrases we heard from the president today, Pierre, was domestic terrorism. The FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, the entire Department of Justice have been warning that this is a major threat right now, and it's growing.
Absolutely, George. The FBI is reporting to us that they've seen a surge in hate crimes reported by local police. That's a real ongoing threat. There are currently about 850 open domestic terrorism cases that the nation is facing. And, George, they're quite concerned that hate is fueling people going out and actually killing people. We recently have seen a significant spike also in people showing up in public places like schools, malls, workplaces to kill. We used to average about 6 of those a year. We're now up to 30 times a year where people are showing up in these scenarios, George, and law enforcement today is warning that because of what we saw this weekend, that there might be more potential for more domestic terrorism and copycats, George.
And Pierre, in that 6-point program the president laid out right there, does that echo what you've been hearing from those in the Department of Justice? They're saying this is what we need to be doing right now?
It's among the things that we're hearing people talk about. And one of the things that everyone that I'm talking to emphasizes is that often these killers are putting something online or telling relatives and friends something that is overtly violent, and oftentimes people are not coming forward to tell law enforcement. All law enforcement is emphasizing in these moments, people have got to, even if it's a friend, even if it's a family member, they've got to come forward and tell law enforcement.
Okay, Pierre, thanks very much. Here was Cecilia Vega as well. You did see those words from the president, Cecilia, condemning racism, bigotry, and white supremacy. As recently as just a few weeks ago, though, he was downplaying the problem of white nationalism.
Yeah, the pattern here is this one. So the president today directly confronts, you said it, his strongest word yet against white nationalism and racism in this country. And we saw him say similar words after Charlottesville. And then right after that, we heard him say those famous words. There were very fine people in both sides. Our Terry Moran was in the White House just a couple of months ago and asked the president, does he believe white nationalism is a growing threat? And the president minced 0 words, and he said, no, I do not believe it is. David said it. I think a lot of people will, particularly the Democrats in the 2020 race right now, will hear the president's words as empty, that they lacked self-reflection. I think they might challenge him and say, because this tenor and this tone, they're laying the blame directly at his feet this morning for where we are in this country.
The question is, how has his rhetoric contributed to the environment, even though he can't be responsible for the murder itself? And one of the questions will be, does this rhetoric that we've seen today continue in the coming days, including on his Twitter feed? I want to bring in Mary Bruce, our senior congressional correspondent, as well. Notably, Mary, the president did not have an explicit call for new gun legislation there, for anything on background checks. That's one of the things that the Democrats have been demanding.
Yeah, George, you heard the president saying that they need real bipartisan solutions and vowing to act with urgency. But here in the House, they have passed a bipartisan bill, bipartisan legislation that would require universal background checks. Those are measures that we know that an overwhelming majority of Americans support. It was passed several months ago in the House, but over in the Senate, Republican leader Mitch McConnell has refused for months to even call this up for a vote. And the president himself has previously threatened to veto this legislation. Now, earlier this morning, the president tweeted suggesting that he may be open now to strengthening background checks, but it was not mentioned at all in his remarks from the White House just now. So a bit of mixed messaging perhaps coming from the White House. And now, of course, we're seeing Democrats here trying to up the pressure. They are demanding that Mitch McConnell bring lawmakers back here to Washington to try and do something to address rising gun violence. But as we've seen time and time again, it does not seem that there is the political will or interest from Republican leaders to be addressing stricter gun measures at this time.
That's the question I want to ask you. Does it feel different on Capitol Hill? Of course, everyone's away on the recess. Does it feel different on Capitol Hill this time that the pressure might actually build in a way that Mitch McConnell will feel forced to accede to those calls and bring the Congress back?
So far, George, we are seeing an all too familiar pattern play out here. And unless you see increasing pressure coming from Republicans and coming from the president himself, it is very hard to see how Mitch McConnell is going to all of a sudden go ahead and comply with Democrats' request that lawmakers come back here to try and tackle this. Mitch McConnell, we've seen him come out and call this violence senseless and sickening, sending thoughts and prayers to the victims. But when I've asked his team what he plans to do about it, whether he's going to bring lawmakers back here to Washington, they say McConnell does not have any additional comment at this time, George.
We will see how that plays out during the day. Again, President Trump now speaking out against the racism, bigotry, and white supremacy and evil that we've seen this weekend in El Paso, Texas, also Dayton, Ohio. We're going to continue to cover this all day long on ABC News Live. Of course, David Muir, World News anchor David Muir, is in El Paso tonight for World News Tonight with David Muir. And we're going to leave you now. For many of you on the West Coast, that will be Good Morning America.
And continuing coverage here on ABC News Live, I'm Devin Dwyer in Washington. Alex Mallon, our senior justice reporter. I want to go over to the White House now, and our White House reporter, Catherine Falders, who has been reporting on this and the president's reaction all morning. Catherine, you were back talking to senior aides as they were preparing for President Trump's remarks. A real sense of emergency and urgency at the White House, even if some specifics were lacking from that speech.
Yeah, we know these remarks, as is any speech with the president, they're edited down to the last minute. But Devin, this was different. It felt different over here. You saw the president take to Twitter this morning, blaming the media and also suggesting that there needs to be some background check legislation, but also that could perhaps be prepared with immigration reform. And look, this shooting had nothing to do with immigration reform. So that was against the objections. Some of his top aides objected to this, and they were meeting at the last minute trying to figure out what to put in this speech. And you saw that he didn't mention that at all. You saw the president took a very different tune in this address he just gave to the nation, his most forceful condemnation of white supremacy. But there was always that fear from top aides that he may undercut what he just told the American people, potentially in some tweets or other remarks later on.
We're already getting reaction in from gun safety groups, gun advocacy groups. The Giffords Foundation has just put out a statement responding to President Trump, saying his rhetoric is largely empty promises. Alex, we've been here before. The president today outlining 6 steps that he thinks should be taken, but no specifics, no legislation, no call to action from Congress, sort of generic, really boilerplate, if you will, ideas that I think most people agree with. The violence in our culture needs to be dialed back. We need to act on early warning signs. What's the view from the Justice Department right now? He did say that he's reached out to his Attorney General to come up with some ideas.
Yeah, and he says he plans to issue a directive both to the Justice Department and the FBI to try and find ways to root out domestic terrorism and also make it make hate crimes punishable by the death penalty in a quicker fashion. He wants to warn these people who want to go out and commit these hate crimes that they'll be punished immediately by death. Now, there's questions as to whether the death penalty is even an effective deterrent. But this also just does not feel like there's going to be any real immediate action that does something to deter these people from coming out of the woodwork. And it's important to note that domestic terrorism currently is not a federal charge that you can even charge somebody with. We saw in the case of the Charlottesville massacre, or the Charlottesville car attack, that person, it was treated as a case of domestic terrorism, but he was actually convicted on hate crimes charges. So this is something that if we are going to prosecute domestic terrorism as a charge, that's going to be something that has to come from Congress to create it as a statute.
And no mention from the president today of the fact that at least the El Paso attack was an attack perpetrated on the Mexican community. The president did mention the manifesto, but Alex, as you've learned from the Justice Department, a significant portion, almost a third of all domestic terror cases in this country right now are perpetrated with a link to white supremacy.
Yeah, and Director Ray just spoke to Congress about 2 weeks ago and raised the alarm specifically about what he's seen as a surge of these white supremacist motivated attacks that are on the rise. And I think it's really just about these, specifically this website that we know that the El Paso shooter posted his screed. It was called 8chan, and they were brought down yesterday. They're taken off, deplatformed essentially. But it was after a bunch of public pressure. There's just what the president called for specifically in his remarks is to have these social media companies, internet experts work together with the Justice Department to be able to find and root out these people who are posting threats. But it does present a lot of First Amendment issues. It's a very thorny area because while it may be wrong to post racist screeds like that, unless you are imminently threatening some type of violence, there's just really little that the Justice Department and authorities can really do to stop you.
We do know, as the investigation continues, a lot of these sentiments, these ideas that are on 8chan have been circulating for some time, but it's really the empowerment of these individuals under this current administration, a lot of them specifically referencing rhetoric by President Trump. I want to bring in someone who has talked a lot about that, John Cohen, our ABC News contributor, former DHS official. John, were you surprised that the president made no mention of the rhetoric in our political climate right now as a potential contributing factor here?
Yeah, I wasn't surprised. I was disappointed, though. I thought, on the one hand, the president did say some things that should have been said, as it relates to the threat posed by domestic extremism and white supremacy. He recognized that we need to do a better job in educating the public and training law enforcement to recognize the warning signs. And he mentioned, the impact of the internet, social media, and the need for mental health support. But what surprised me a little bit, or disappointed me a little bit, was he didn't mention the impact that our current political climate has, as you just mentioned. He also didn't mention the Department of Homeland Security, and he didn't mention the important role that they play or have played in the past in dealing with these issues. And he didn't talk about restoring the funding that he diverted from programs that would have addressed many of these issues, and they're using it instead now for immigration enforcement. So, he hit some of the key issues, but I would have thought that at this point, with so many of these attacks having occurred over the last 2.5 years, that we would have heard more substance.
There certainly was a good bit of dissonance in the president's remarks just now. Catherine Faulders, you've been talking to White House officials. You also know the president's record pretty well. He once opposed assault weapons in this country, called for a ban back after the Parkland shooting. He thought that the age to purchase a gun should be raised, 18 in this country, to be able to buy a firearm. He's let that fall by the wayside. Universal background check, something he supported. None of those things were mentioned today.
No, none of those things were mentioned in his remarks today. I know that they will be meeting throughout the day, his advisors, just to discuss next steps here, how, there were a lot of broad policy proposals, in a sense, as Alex mentioned, the death penalty, what to do about social media posts. But we didn't hear background checks mentioned at all here, like he posted about this morning on Twitter. So I know that there's going to be meetings throughout the day on that, Devin. And I think we can expect to hear more from him on this, but we are pressing the White House on specific policy proposals. And I do think, just from talking to sources in here, that there's really this sense of they don't exactly know what's next here, how to specifically address this.
One of the lines from the president's remarks that's getting a lot of pushback right now was his reference to mental illness in this country. The president said mental illness and hatred pulls the trigger, not the gun. Pierre Thomas, our Chief Justice correspondent, you've covered so many of these mass shootings, these tragedies. We're hearing from gun safety advocates right now. They say mental health is not the problem. There are comparable rates in this country, can be a contributing factor, but the president would shine the spotlight on that is misplaced.
Well, many people in those communities, the people who are advocating for more gun legislation, believe that we need to have universal background checks in place right now. And there is considerable frustration that the House passed a background check measure earlier this year, and apparently so far the Senate Majority Leader McConnell has not brought that up for a vote. That is an issue. But I can tell you from a law enforcement perspective, they believe that all the above needs to be addressed. They believe that they need to have something that will flag the system if someone is experiencing a mental health challenge and they somehow have gotten access to a weapon and they've in the past discussed harming themselves or others. They want to know about that so that can be flagged. If you look at what happened in Parkland, that young man had all kinds of issues that people knew about, and in fact the FBI got some information and didn't follow through on it. But the other major thing that's going on right now is the FBI is deeply concerned about a surge in police reporting of hate crimes involving individuals who identify as white supremacists. That is an issue. And you even saw that in quick response to what happened this past weekend, both in El Paso and Dayton, that the FBI put out a statement last night warning about the concern that those events could spark other people to commit acts of domestic terrorism or copycats. So right now, this issue of race and hate and violence is at the forefront of what law enforcement is concerned about, even as they try to deal with groups like ISIS and domestic Islamic radicals as well.
Yeah, real fear about copycats. This shooter in El Paso allegedly referenced the New Zealand massacre down there as part of his inspiration. Pierre Thomas, thank you so much. Mary Bruce, quickly to you, there are two pieces of legislation on the table House Democrats have been talking about the last 24 hours. Tell us about what's pending and why it's stuck in the Senate right now.
Yeah, so the House a few months ago did pass these bipartisan bills that would require universal background checks. That's a measure that we know that the overwhelming majority of Americans support, but they have been stuck essentially because Mitch McConnell has refused to even call them up for a vote. The president himself has threatened to veto these measures, even though earlier this morning he seemed to suggest that there was some wiggle room here, perhaps the president tweeting that we need strong background checks, but then in his remarks just now, he didn't mention background checks at all. Democrats are incredibly frustrated. They are demanding that Mitch McConnell call lawmakers back from their month-long recess so that they can take some kind of action on this legislation, or take any kind of action, really, to do something to try to address rising gun violence. But, Devin, it is really hard to see, unless the president puts political pressure on Republicans here on the Hill, it's hard to see how they are going to muster all of a sudden the political capital and will and interest to go ahead and do something on stricter gun measures. I simply don't think it's going to happen.
Yeah, lawmakers out until after Labor Day, so no sign they're coming back anytime soon. Mary Bruce, thank you so much. And thanks again to Pierre Thomas and Catherine Falders over at the White House. Much more on the two tragedies over the weekend ahead here on ABC News Live at 11 o'clock in the debrief with Kimberly Brooks. I'll be back with Alex Mallon this afternoon, 3:30 Eastern time here for a special edition of the Briefing Room. We'll hope you will join us for that conversation. But right now, we will replay for you President Trump's statement just a few moments ago on the tragedies over the weekend and his plans to address it.